Today I will read you a scary story from my subscriber. Something is wrong with this apartment. I moved into the apartment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't exactly what I'd dreamed of, but dreams were expensive and this place was, well, within budget. Third floor, end of the hall, with creaky wooden floors and a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. But it had character, or so I kept telling myself as I lugged boxes up the narrow staircase. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, according to the landlord. Job transfer, he'd mumbled while jingling the keys in his hand. He hadn't said much else, just that the apartment was solid and the neighbors were quiet. By the second night, I'd mostly settled in. The living room was a mess of half-unpacked boxes, but my bed was made and the fridge was stocked with cheap beer and takeout leftovers. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when I first heard it. Thump. A single, heavy footstep from the apartment next door. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then came another sound, softer this time, like something dragging across the floor. Furniture, maybe? Someone moving a chair. It wasn't exactly unusual. Old buildings had thin walls. I figured the neighbor was rearranging something, maybe setting up late. But then I remembered what the landlord had said when I'd asked about the neighboring unit. Empty. Been that way for a while? I sat up, straining to listen. Another scrape. Then a low, muffled sound like someone speaking, too quiet to make out. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the noise was coming from above or below. Sounded weird things in old buildings. I stuffed in my earbuds, cranked up some music, and eventually drifted off. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was clearer, slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. A pause. Then a heavy thud, like something hitting the floor. By the third night, it wasn't just noises. I could swear I heard whispering soft, broken sentences I couldn't quite piece together. That's when I decided to ask around. The next morning, I caught the old woman from across the hall as she was heading out, her little dog yapping at my feet. Hey, sorry to bother you, I started, but do you know who lives in the apartment next to mine? She blinked at me over her thick glasses. Next door? Nobody's there, hon. That place has been empty for at least 2 years. Leaky pipes, I think. I hesitated. Are you sure? I've been hearing stuff. Like someone's in there. She pursed her lips, tugging at the dog's leash. You're not the first to say that. Last guy who lived in your unit said the same thing. Heard noises, footsteps. Drove him nuts. Did he ever figure out what it was? She shook her head, but her eyes darkened for a beat too long. Nope. He didn't last long here. Moved out after a month. Said it felt like someone was watching him all the time. She didn't wait for more questions, just shuffled off down the hall, her dog still barking. I stood there, the hallway suddenly feeling colder than it had a minute ago. That night, the sounds didn't just come back, they got louder. That night, the air in my apartment felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I tried to focus on a movie, volume cranked louder than usual, but my ears kept straining for sounds that shouldn't have been there. Every little creak of the old building made me flinch. Around midnight, the noises started again. Thud. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just on the other side of the wall behind my couch. It felt methodical, like whoever, or whatever, was there knew I was listening. I muted the TV. Scrape. Something heavy dragging across the floor. The footsteps followed, this time stopping right where my living room wall met the neighbor's. I could practically feel the vibrations through the plaster. Hello? I called out before I could stop myself. No answer. I stood up, my heart hammering, and walked to the wall, pressing my ear against it. For a moment, there was only silence, then, clear as day, I heard it. Knock. 3 hard knocks, like someone responding. I jerked away, cold sweat breaking across my back. Okay, maybe someone was in there. Squatters? Some kid who'd found a way in? I grabbed my keys and headed out into the hall, suddenly desperate to prove to myself that there was a normal explanation for this. The hallway was dead quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I walked to the door of the neighboring apartment, 3B, and stood there for a second, working up the nerve. The door looked normal enough. Beige paint worn around the edges. Dusty. But when I leaned in closer, I noticed something weird. The doorknob had faint scratch marks around it, as if someone had been trying to force it open or force it closed. I knocked. Nothing. Hello? If someone's in there, you shouldn't be. Still nothing. I reached for the knob, half expecting it to be locked tight, but it turned under my hand. My stomach dropped. But when I pushed, the door wouldn't budge. It felt like something heavy was pressed against it from the inside. And then, slam. The door jerked forward, nearly hitting me in the face, before it snapped shut again with violent force. I stumbled backward. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one in the hall. No sounds of footsteps running away. The door stood there, silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, sunlight did little to wash away the creeping dread that had settled over me. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the door slamming shut on its own. No footsteps, no voices, just that violent snap like something inside didn't want me there. I barely touched my coffee, my hands shaking too much to hold the mug steady. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my stuff and leave, but a heavier part of me, curiosity, maybe stubbornness, kept me rooted. There has to be an explanation, I kept telling myself. By mid-afternoon, I convinced myself to go downstairs and talk to the landlord. The office was a cramped, dusty room off the lobby, with walls yellowed from years of cigarette smoke. "Hey, quick question about 3B, I started. The landlord, Greg, mid-50s, balding, and perpetually annoyed, didn't even look up from his crossword puzzle. "Told you, it's empty." "Yeah, I know, but I think someone might have broken in. I heard noises, footsteps, dragging sounds. The door even slammed shut when I was in the hall last night. That got his attention. He lowered the newspaper, eyes narrowing. No one's got keys to that place but me, and it's been locked up tight." I hesitated. "Could I don't know, go in there? Just to check?" Greg snorted. "You think I want liability if you trip and bust your head open? No way." But something about the way he shifted in his seat, like he knew something but didn't want to talk about it, gnawed at me. That night, the sounds started earlier. I was in the kitchen, microwaving leftovers, when the low thud echoed through the wall again. The same slow footsteps, this time closer. I turned off the microwave and stood there, heart racing, as something scraped against the wall, right behind the fridge. I moved closer. Scratch. Long, deliberate scratches like fingernails dragging across drywall. The hairs on my arms stood up. I ran into the living room, grabbed the broom, and slammed the handle against the wall. "Cut it out." Silence. Then, tap. Light knocks right above my head. The broom clattered from my hands as I staggered back. My heart was thudding so hard I could barely think. I didn't sleep that night either. But I did sit in the dark, lights off, staring at the wall until sunrise, waiting to hear it again. And somewhere around 3 a.m., I swear I heard whispering. It was right behind me. I didn't remember falling asleep. 1 minute I was sitting on the couch, lights off, clutching the broom like it was going to do anything if something actually happened. The next, I jolted awake, my neck stiff and the room eerily quiet. The clock on the wall blinked 3:47 a.m. For a few blissful seconds, I thought the worst was over, that maybe I'd dreamed it all, until I noticed the cold. The air in the apartment felt sharp, like winter had crept in through the cracks, though it was late spring outside. My breath fogged faintly in front of me. Then came the whispering again. I sat up, my ears straining. It was faint, muffled, like someone speaking through a thick wall, just out of reach. "Can't leave." I whipped my head toward the sound. It was coming from the wall behind the TV. "Hello." My voice cracked. The whispering stopped. I stood, my bare feet cold against the hardwood, and inched toward the wall. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear over it. Then, clear as day, a voice spoke. "It's not empty." I stumbled backward, slamming into the coffee table, knocking over an empty glass. "Who's there?" I shouted. Silence. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911. But before I could hit the call button, 3 loud, deliberate knocks echoed from the other side of the wall. Knock. This wasn't in my head. Screw it. I wasn't spending another second in that apartment. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed my feet into sneakers, and bolted. The hallway was cold too, unnaturally so. Every light overhead flickered as I passed, my footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. But when I passed 3B, I stopped. The door was cracked open. It hadn't been before. A thin line of darkness stretched into the apartment beyond, blacker than it should have been. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped closer, peering in. The apartment was pitch black inside, but I could just make out shapes. furniture covered in dusty sheets, a window cracked open, curtains barely moving in the breeze. And then, right before my eyes, the door slowly swung shut. Click. The lock turned on its own. I didn't wait around after that. I sprinted down the stairs and didn't stop until I was out on the street, gulping cold air, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped my phone. But here's the worst part. When I looked back up at the building, there was someone standing in the window of 3B. Tall, thin shadow just watching me. I stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, my breath clouding in the cold air as I stared up at the third-floor window. The figure didn't move. It was just there, tall, still, framed by the thin curtains that shifted gently in the breeze. No face, no details, just a human-shaped shadow, standing where no one should have been. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, hoping it was some trick of the light. But when I looked again, it was still there, closer to the glass this time, like it was leaning in, watching. That was enough. I turned and walked fast, not quite running but not far from it, until I was a few blocks away. I ended up at an all-night diner, one of those places that always smells like burnt coffee and fried eggs. I sat in a booth by the window, my back to the door, hands still shaking as I stirred cream into a cup of coffee I didn't really want. I kept going over it in my head. The door moving by itself, the voice through the wall, the figure in the window. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw, or at least I hoped I did. A couple hours passed before I worked up the nerve to go back. The sun was starting to rise, the sky turning a thin, washed-out gray. Everything looked normal again. Too normal. The apartment building loomed in front of me, its cracked brick facade bathed in soft morning light. No shadows in the windows now. No flickering hall lights. Still, I hesitated at the front door for a solid minute before I finally swiped my key fob and slipped inside. The hall leading to my apartment felt heavy, like the air hadn't shifted in years. I glanced at 3B as I passed. Door shut, locked tight, no signs of anyone inside. But when I got to my place and pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Damp, metallic, like rust or old blood. I followed it into the living room, my shoes squeaking faintly against the warped hardwood. And there, on the wall that bordered the neighboring apartment, were 3 long, deep scratches. Grooves clawed into the plaster, trailing from the top corner all the way down to the floor. They hadn't been there before. Something had been inside my apartment. I didn't even realize I was backing away until my heel hit the door. My throat was dry, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. That's when my phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. You shouldn't have looked. My thumb hovered over the screen, heart racing so hard it made my vision blur for a second. You shouldn't have looked. I didn't recognize the number. No name, no history, just those 4 words. I tried calling it. Straight to voicemail. The logical part of my brain scrambled for an answer. Spam? A prank? But there was that cold knot in my gut, tightening by the second, because someone had been in my apartment. Someone who knew I'd been watching. I spent the next few hours pacing the place, curtains shut tight, every light on, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The building was dead quiet. Eventually, against every survival instinct I had, I made the stupidest decision of my life. I decided to go back to 3B. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I saw what was inside, it would make all of this, make sense. I grabbed my toolbox and a flashlight, shoved them into my backpack, and headed into the hall. The 3rd floor felt colder than before. My footsteps echoed as I made my way toward 3B, its door looming like a mouth that didn't quite close right. I tried the knob. Locked. But then I noticed something. Small scratches around the keyhole, fresh ones, as if someone had forced it open and closed it again in a hurry. I pulled a thin flathead screwdriver from my bag and worked at the lock. I was no expert, but the old hardware gave way with a soft click. The door creaked open. The air inside was stale and freezing cold, like no sunlight had touched the place in years. I stepped in, the floor groaning under my weight. The whole apartment was empty, mostly. Dusty white sheets covered bulky furniture, corners sagging, shadows pooling underneath. Faint light bled in through the curtains, illuminating floating motes of dust. I swept the flashlight across the room. Nothing. Living room, kitchen, both barren. But then I noticed the hallway leading deeper into the apartment. The door at the end was slightly ajar. The smell hit me again. Rust, damp wood, and something else. Something sour. I crept toward it, each step creaking louder than the last. I pushed the door open with the tip of the flashlight. It was a bedroom. Bare walls, broken blinds, but the closet door on the far side was wide open. And carved deep into the wall, behind where the bed must have been, were more of those long scratches. Only this time there was something else too. Letters. Words scratched into the paint in jagged, frantic lines. "IT knows you're here." The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, flashlight jerking through the dark. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, coming from the hall. I barely made it to the window before the footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't look back as I shoved the window open and climbed out onto the rusty fire escape, my breath fogging in front of me. When I glanced back inside, the bedroom was empty again. But the closet door? It was swinging shut slowly, like someone had just stepped out of it. I didn't wait. I scrambled down the fire escape, my hands slipping on the rusted rails, feet slamming against each metal step. Every clang echoed through the narrow alley like gunshots. When I finally hit the pavement, I didn't look back, I just ran. By the time I stopped, I was blocks away, bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air. The city buzzed around me like nothing had happened, cars honking, people walking by, their worlds untouched by what I'd just seen. But my mind wouldn't stop replaying it. The scratches on the wall. The slamming door. The closet door slowly closing on its own. Something had been in there. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I booked a cheap motel room on the edge of town, one of those places where the carpets smell like wet dog and the AC unit rattles nonstop. But it felt safer. At least until my phone buzzed again. Another text. "Unknown number, you can't run from it." I didn't sleep. The next day I went digging. The town library had old property records, and after about an hour of flipping through dusty files and squinting at microfilm, I found it. 3B had history. 2 years ago, the last tenant, a guy named David Creel, had disappeared. No trace, no signs of foul play. Cops assumed he bailed on rent and skipped town. But I found a local news clipping. Neighbors had reported hearing weird noises from his apartment for weeks before he vanished. The phrasing chilled me. Footsteps, dragging sounds, and what some described as faint whispering through the walls. Exactly what I'd been hearing. But here's what really got me. There was a note in the police report. Bedroom closet door was found open. Scratches observed on the walls. No signs of forced entry. I sat there in the library, skin cold, heart sinking. Whatever had been in that apartment didn't start with me. It had been there, waiting. And then I thought of something worse. What if it wasn't stuck in 3B? What if, now that I'd seen it, it could follow me? That night, back at the motel, I triple-locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and left every light on. But around 2 a.m., the bulb in the bathroom flickered and went out. I sat there, frozen, watching shadows stretch across the stained walls. And then, knock, knock, knock. It came from the closet in the corner of the motel room. I wasn't even near 3B anymore. It had followed me. The drive back felt like marching straight into my own grave. Every mile closer to the apartment made the air in the car feel heavier, thicker, like the thing was already waiting for me right where this all started. The sun had barely set when I pulled up to the building. It looked the same as the day I moved in, cracked brick, flickering hallway light through the front door, but now it felt wrong. Like the whole place had been hollowed out. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, staring up at the third floor. The window of 3B was dark. Curtains unmoving. No shadow in the glass this time. But I knew it was there. I made my way upstairs. The hall was dead silent. Every step echoed down the empty corridor, my sneakers sticking slightly to the worn floor tiles. When I reached 3B, I expected the door to be locked. It wasn't. The knob turned easily under my hand. The door creaked open. The air inside was ice cold, thick with dust, and something sour like mold or rot. I stepped in. The flashlight beam swept across the room, dusty sheets still draped over furniture, deep shadows pooling in corners, but the scratches on the walls were worse now. Deeper. Longer. As if something had been tearing through the place. I didn't call out. Didn't bother. Whatever was here already knew I was back. I headed straight for the bedroom. The closet door was wide open this time. No hesitation. I walked right up to it, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. Empty. But the scratches inside the closet were fresh, deep gouges along the back wall. That's when I noticed something strange. A thin crack in the paneling. I pressed my fingers against it and the panel shifted. It swung open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black space behind it. A crawl space. My stomach dropped. This is where it is. I slid inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air was suffocating, thick with dust, damp, the smell of old wood and rusted metal. My flashlight flickered as I crawled forward, the narrow space forcing me low. Then my hand brushed something cold. Metal. I shone the light down. A ring of old keys, rusted and dusty, lying right in the dirt. But next to them, scraps of paper. I picked one up, the edges brittle. Scrawled in frantic handwriting. It watches through the walls. Another read. If you see it, it's already too late. A low creak echoed behind me. I turned. The entrance to the crawl space was gone, blocked by a wall of darkness. And then, right behind me, a whisper. Close. You brought me back. The whisper felt like breath against the back of my neck, cold, damp, and real. I scrambled forward, the narrow walls of the crawl space closing in, my flashlight flickering wildly as I dragged myself through the dirt and dust. My hands clawed at the rotting wood, splinters driving deep into my fingers, but I barely felt them. Behind me, I heard it move. Heavy, dragging footsteps. Slow. Patient. Like it knew I wasn't getting out. Come on, I hissed, my voice ragged as I shoved against the boards. The flashlight died. Pitch black swallowed me whole. And then a hand ice cold clamped around my ankle. I kicked hard, my heel connecting with something solid. The grip loosened just enough for me to lurch forward. I slammed my shoulder against the crawl space wall with everything I had. The wood cracked. One more shove. I tumbled out, coughing dust from my lungs, sprawled across the apartment floor. The air outside the crawl space was somehow worse, charged, heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Behind me, from the darkness of the crawl space, I heard it again. You can't leave me here. But I did. I ran. Down the hall. Down the stairs. Out into the freezing night air. I didn't stop running until the apartment building was just a shape in the distance, its dark windows like hollow eyes. I never went back. It took me a month to find a new place, out in the suburbs, a house this time. Old, sure, but quiet. Solid. I told myself it was over. New walls. New floors. Nothing behind them. But even now, late at night, I still hear it. Scratches in the walls. Soft, deliberate knocks. Sometimes when the house is quiet, I catch whispers I can't explain, just at the edge of hearing. And every time I turn off the lights, I feel it. That weight in the room. Like I'm not alone. I know it followed me. I brought it with me when I crawled out of that darkness. And now it's here. Waiting. And it's never leaving.